Hello, and welcome to a virtual edition of IMF Inspired, a conversation series that seeks to inspire, provoke, and spark action. It is always a great pleasure to kick off this event as I get the unique privilege to introduce a dynamic young woman to our audience. A woman whose work and commitment to excellence seeks to change the world for the better. Today's conversation focuses on the gender data gap, a perennial issue, but especially pertinent now as we try to understand the impact of the pandemic on women globally. And we have a fabulous speaker. Ms. Caroline Criado Perez is an award-winning writer, a tireless feminist campaigner, and in her book, Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, she brings to fore the inequalities faced by women at home, at work, in health, in technology, and in our policies. She exposes a systemic lack of gender data and how it prevents the changes necessary to create a thriving environment for women in different walks of life. Now we face a pandemic which clearly has disproportionately affected women and their economic status. Our work at the fund has highlighted the many factors that are driving this trend. Women are more likely than men to work in sectors that have been hardest hit by the crisis, more likely to be employed in the informal sector. They bear the brunt of family care responsibilities, and they're also at a greater risk of losing human capital. The pandemic threatens to reverse the gains in women's economic opportunities. We fought for these gains so hard. They can widen the gender gaps that persist despite 30 years of progress. Closing these gender gaps was always important, but with COVID-19 upon us, it has become even more important to ensure equitable and inclusive post-COVID-19 recovery. Caroline has rightly emphasized the need for collecting disaggregated data, so we can see what happens to women vis-a-vis what happens to and with men. And it is important to have this data now to grasp the impact of COVID-19 on women. In fact, disaggregated data will be critical for policymakers in adopting measures, particularly gender-responsive fiscal policies, to limit the scarring effect of the pandemic on women. Caroline's book has received many accolades. It was awarded the 2019 FT and McKinsey Business Book of the Year. And at that time, the jury chair called the book the Simone de Beauvoir with data. Caroline also received the Royal Society Science Book Prize for that book. And for those of you who are Jane Austen aficionados, you will be delighted to know that Caroline led the successful campaign in the UK to feature the author on the 10-pound note. She also led the campaign to erect the first statue of a woman, suffragist Millicent Fawcett, in Parliament Square. So you pass by, if you are in London, it is her who did it. Caroline was the 2013 recipient of the Liberty Human Rights Campaigner of the Year award. She was named Order of the British Empire in the 2015 Queen's Birthday Honours for services to diversity and equality. And joining the discussion today, we also will have our very own Sabina Bhatia, Deputy Secretary of the IMF. For years, Sabina worked closely with civil society organizations and with young people to make the fund more open to diverse voices. And it is Sabina who conceptualized and curated the IMF Inspired series, part of it you are guest for today. I'm excited to listen in the conversation. And what I want to ask you to do whenever you are is extend a warm welcome to Caroline and Sabina. And with this, over to you, Sabina.
Thank you, Kristalina, for your kind remarks, and a very warm welcome to you, Caroline. We are delighted to have you here for our annual meetings. So, Caroline, reading your book was an eye-opener for me. Many of the issues you raise are familiar, but I had never thought of them in terms of bias and lack of data. Something as simple as snow clearing. Who would have thought that it impacts women and men differently? And you have numerous such examples in your book. So talk to us about some of your findings and what prompted you to write this book.
So basically, what the book is about, as has been mentioned, is the gender data gap. So the gender data gap is basically the term that I use for the fact that the vast majority of information that has been collected globally and that we continue to collect, so everything from medical data to economic data to urban planning data, has been collected mainly on men. And the result of that is that most things in the world, from the medical treatment you receive to the public transport or the private transport that you may use, to the phone that you may be watching this on now, to the apps on that phone, have mainly been designed to work for men, obviously, because they've been designed on data collected on men. And so the result is that most things in the world just don't work as well for women as they work for men. So to give you perhaps the sort of most glaring example, I think, well, one of the most glaring examples of the whole book is car crash safety. So for decades, the only car crash test dummy that was used, and it's still the most commonly used car crash test dummy, was based around the anthropometric dimensions of a 50th percentile American male. Now, of course, that is a bigger person than your average woman, but this car crash test dummy was used as if it could represent the average human. So it's too big and it's too heavy, and that causes all sorts of problems in car safety design. So just to give a few examples, seat belts, for example, have never been designed and have never been tested on how they interact with breast tissue. A lot of women find seat belts very uncomfortable because they cut into their neck, because they don't know how to wind them around their breasts. We've never designed a seat belt yet that is safe for women to use during pregnancy. And the result of this is that women try sort of workarounds, and it means that they end up wearing the seat belt unsafely. So, for example, tucking it under their arm, which, by the way, you should absolutely not do. Then you have issues like the seat back is too firm. This isn't an issue of comfort. This is basically because it's been designed that way in order to absorb the weight of this average male car crash test dummy. But that car crash test dummy, as I've said, is bigger and heavier. And so women get thrown further forward in the event of a crash because this seat back isn't absorbing their weight in the way that it's meant to. And then you add on to that the fact that women tend to sit further forward than men, again, because they're shorter. So they need to sit further forward to reach the seatbelt, the pedals and the steering wheel. And that moves them outside of what's thought of as, the standard seating position. That is the seating position that is optimal for safety, which has been designed around this average 50th percentile male. And when you put all these issues together, and, there are obviously various other issues, you find that women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in the event of a crash and 17% more likely to die than a man in the same car crash. Now, to be clear, there is what is called a female car crash test dummy that is used, for example, in the EU. That was introduced in 2015. They belatedly realized that women exist. But the problem with this dummy is that it's not actually an average female dummy, right? It's just a very, very scaled down male dummy. And of course, women are not just scaled down men. There are all sorts of differences other than size. So, things like pelvic differences in spinal column flexibility, differences in muscle mass distribution. So men have more muscle mass in their necks and their upper body. And of course, that matters for things like whiplash, which is the most common injury that you get from car crashes. And also this dummy is only used in 1 out of the 5 regulatory EU tests and only in the passenger seat. So, even with this so-called female car crash test dummy, we're still not using it as commonly as we're using the male car crash test dummy. And the reason I think this example is very useful is because it really shows what is at the heart of this gender data gap bias. And it's basically that we are so used to thinking of men as the default sex, as somehow sexless, gender neutral, just representative of humans overall, that somehow it made sense for us to test cars on only half the population. And this is something that you find, and certainly that I found in my research, pretty much everywhere you care to look. It's in technology, it's in, as I said, urban planning, as you mentioned, the snow clearing, which I'm guessing I don't really have time to go into, but tell me if I do, because I can quickly go into the snow clearing.
Actually, you have so many great examples. I just want to pick up on your point, because really your car crash example shows how serious the consequences are. So I just want to move to another area that is very serious, and that's on medicine and health. And you've talked about how there's not enough data or research on women, and especially the fact that women are underrepresented in clinical trials. And I'm just wondering, as we are living through the COVID-19, how is this playing out right now, and how is it shaping our policy response?
Yeah, it's been so frustrating to watch, because this is a virus where the sex-specific impacts could not be clearer, right? It was clear very, very early on that more men were dying. But because we weren't collecting sex disaggregated data right from the beginning in terms of who was testing positive, who was getting tested, and who was being hospitalized and who was dying, it was at the beginning, we wasted time not being sure whether these were sex effects or gender effects. What do I mean by that? Well, basically sex being biology and gender being the sort of social construct. And so, for example, was it that men were more likely to catch COVID because, they were more exposed for one reason or another, or was there something biological going on that meant that their bodies were less able to fight off the disease? And because we weren't catching sex disaggregated data on who was getting it and also who was dying from it, it took us much longer than it should have to be able to give an answer on that. We are still in a situation, by the way, where the vast majority of countries are not publishing systematically sex disaggregated data on who is getting tested, who is testing positive, and deaths. And I stress that you need to have who is getting the tests as well as who is testing positive, because, of course, if you don't know who's getting the tests, it could be that, either men or women are more likely to test positive just because they're more likely to get a test. So it's really important that you have all three, but we still aren't getting it. And similarly, even when it comes to research, again, of this disease that is sex-specific in its impacts, we are still seeing so many papers coming out that are not sex disaggregating their data, that aren't even being, including equal numbers of men and women. And this really matters. When you look back at the sort of history of having excluded women from medical research, the negative impacts have been mainly felt by women, right? Women are more likely to suffer from adverse drug reactions, and those can be very serious, requiring hospitalization. Of course, they can also be fatal. They are more likely to be misdiagnosed or take longer to get a diagnosis for a whole range of diseases, including certain cancers and heart disease, which obviously, again, this can be fatal. But what we've seen with COVID-19 is that actually this lack of knowledge about the female body has really hampered us in our search for a treatment for men as well. So because we know so much less about the female immune system, we don't really know what it is about the female body that is making, that is meaning that women are better able to fight this disease off. Right? Is it to do with sex chromosomes? Is it to do with hormones? We don't really know. So there was a really interesting trial that I saw being started in Long Island, I think it was in July, where they started injecting men with estrogen, male COVID patients with estrogen, to see if that would help them fight it off. I haven't actually been able to find the results of that study so far. I guess they're still pending. But what really struck me when I read it was a research paper that I reported on in Invisible Women, which kind of looked at a vaguely similar thing. So they took male and female cells and exposed them to estrogen and then exposed them to a virus, obviously not the COVID-19 virus. And the female cells were able to use this estrogen to fight back against the virus, and the male cells were not able to. But, that was only a cell stage study. So, and that was done in 2016. So that really shows, the infancy that we are at when it comes to understanding the female immune system. And now we are also seeing how this doesn't just affect women, it also affects men.
Right. So my big takeaway listening to you, Caroline, is that to have better outcomes for women, you need better data. For example, the IMF promotes financial inclusion, and our financial access survey now has sex disaggregated data. But I guess my question is, why do you think we don't collect this data? And what can be done about it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons. I think that ultimately what they all come back to is this bias that we have of thinking of men as somehow gender neutral, that women are sort of atypical, they're a kind of subtype, and men represent a universal idea of humanity. And of course, when you articulate it as that, it sort of sounds ridiculous, and you sort of think, how can that possibly be true? Of course, people don't think that. But when you look at the excuses for why we are excluding data from women, for me, the only way to really explain how people think that those are adequate justifications is if they are thinking that data from women isn't as important as data from men. So just sticking with medicine for a second, one of the biggest sort of excuses that you'll come across is that basically female bodies are too complicated. The menstrual cycle will interfere with the results. Well, that is true. The menstrual cycle will interfere with the results, but also the menstrual cycle is a fact of life. You're going to have people who have a menstrual cycle taking these drugs. The menstrual cycle will be interfering with the results in real life. And these effects can be very serious. So, for example, women are more likely to experience drug-induced heart rhythm abnormalities. These are most likely to happen during the first half of a woman's menstrual cycle. So, you need to know what those effects are going to be before you release something onto the market. So it's, yes, it is more complicated, but also women make up 50% of the population. And so it doesn't really make sense unless you're not thinking of women as, standard human beings in the way we think of men as standard human beings. Similarly, given the context here, IMF in the economy, it simply does not make sense to talk about measuring the economy when you're excluding this huge tranche of what actually contributes to GDP. You're supposed to be trying to measure something. If you're trying to measure reality, you need to collect all the data that represents reality, right? It doesn't make sense to measure something that isn't real. But again, it only, I think, makes sense if you sort of come back to this idea that we think gathering data on men is enough because they're the standard. And this is a really old bias, right? It goes all the way back to Aristotle. One of my favorite quotes of all time comes from Aristotle, where in his 4th BC biological treatise on the generation of animals, he said, the first departure from type is indeed that the offspring should become female instead of male. So this is a really old bias. It goes back a very long way. You can see it cropping up all the way through history. And it's at the heart of what is going on today in terms of our sort of sense that we don't really need to collect data on women. It's a sort of optional extra. Well, of course it isn't. If you're trying to measure reality, women exist and you're going to have to collect data on them.
And that's a perfect segue to a question that I think is on, top of people's minds, which is that in the pandemic, women are bearing the brunt of the pandemic, juggling work, childcare. In developing countries, women tend to work in the informal sector, which has been hard hit by lockdowns. In fact, UN Women estimates that 47 million women will be thrown into extreme poverty as a result of COVID. So, next week, ministers of finance will be coming to, virtually coming together for annual meetings. If you had to make one or two policy recommendations to them to help women during this crisis, what would that be?
Only one or two. Okay.
Yeah, well, everyone's making demands on our minister, so pick your top two.
Really, the invest in social care. That would be the heart of any policy recommendation that I make. It's been quite frustrating seeing governments come out with these very old school, quite tired responses to any kind of economic shock, which is the idea that we're going to physically build our way out of it. Right? In the UK, for example, the tagline was literally build, build, build. But as you've indicated, it's not men's jobs that are being lost in this pandemic. It's not men who are having to go part-time, who aren't being able to, who are having their hours reduced or losing their jobs or whatever it is. It's women. It's actually been called a she-cession, which is a term that I hate, but that's the term we have. And so it makes no sense to be investing in a very male-dominated area when it's actually women who are the ones who are not being able to go back to work. And why is that? In general, it's because of women's unpaid care work, which has dramatically increased during this pandemic all around the world. And we do not have structures in place to support women with that work. And the very basic fact is that if you want to restart your economy, you need to enable women to get back into paid work. And the only way to enable women to get into paid work is if you support them with the unpaid work that women disproportionately shoulder. Women do 75% of the world's unpaid care work. That, in fact, the IMF's own figures, at least from a few years ago, were that women do 3 times as much childcare and 4 times as much housework as men globally. So I guess and if you want specific policy recommendations, these are slightly more long-term. But my first one, because I think it's a really low-hanging fruit, would be to introduce properly paid use it or lose it paternity leave in every country in the world, because that is such an easy policy recommendation that has been proven in every country it's been introduced in to work. It closes the gender pay gap significantly. It gets more women into work. It also makes men happier, which is actually a really important policy recommendation as well. So it's just a real no-brainer. And the other one would be to introduce universal childcare free at the point of use. Because again, there are so many benefits that come out of that. And then they're not just immediate economic in terms of women contributing more tax and being able to work more. It's also down the road in terms of investing in the children and what they will then go on to be as adults. And again, that's something that's really, really important right now, because one of the huge concerns, of course, of this pandemic and the way that children haven't been able to go to school is the huge inequality gaps that are going to be opening up. This is going to be particularly affecting children from lower income backgrounds who just, are more likely to suffer from not being able to go to school. So yeah, those would be my 2 policy recommendations. I would be so happy if just one country took them up.
Right. Well, we'll see what can be done if our ministers are listening and taking action for the future. Speaking of the future, your next book, can you just very quickly, before I go to questions from our audience, tell us a little bit about what your book's going to cover in just a minute?
So the book is basically a follow-up to Invisible Women, and it's my attempt to answer the question that I got asked at basically every single event I did following the publication of Invisible Women. And that question was, how do we fix this? people were so shocked by the findings of the book of how this lack of data was causing all these problems for women all around the world in sort of small and huge ways, and in ways that you don't necessarily notice. And then you have it pointed out to you and you realize, oh, that's why that never works for me. And so people wanted to know how to fix it. So it's my attempt to try and answer that question. And I'm still in the early stages, so I'm afraid I don't have a spoiler yet of what my answer is going to be. But it's definitely going to include collect sex disaggregated data.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to your book. So we got lots of questions on social media. Now, if I can just bucket them. So there's one bucket of questions on artificial intelligence, big data, and then another one on leadership. So at the IMF, we have the couple of networks. One is the Women Economists Network at the IMF. And I got a question from one of my colleagues there. Says, how can we address gender bias in artificial intelligence?
I mean, it's tricky because basically the technology is way ahead of the data. And the concern is that we are introducing AI into decision-making, and really important decision-making, like risk prediction in health and diagnosis and also HR, without having good enough data to ensure that we aren't making things worse. Because the issue, of course, with machine learning is that it doesn't just reflect our biases back at us, it amplifies them by a significant amount. So one quite frightening study that came out in 2017 looked at how big this amplification effect was. And it trained an algorithm on this very commonly used image data set that happens to have this bias where pictures of cooking are 33% more likely to include women than men. But by the time the algorithm was done being trained on it, the algorithm was connecting pictures of cooking with women 68% of the time. So basically it was labeling pictures of men as female just because they were standing in front of a stove. So that's a pretty big jump. And what I'm seeing in terms of the research papers that are coming out, in terms of algorithms that have been developed, is that there isn't a handle on this. We aren't accounting for it. There was this paper that came out at the end of last year that was reported certainly across the UK media as AI to predict heart attacks 5 years before they happen. But when I read the paper, the studies that it was based on were heavily male-dominated. The paper itself provided barely any sex disaggregated data. And it didn't mention anything like the specific risk factors for women. So, for example, diabetes is a higher risk factor, smoking is a higher risk factor. And yet here was this algorithm just not taking account of these issues. So how do we deal with that when we don't actually have the data? Well, the first step, obviously, is we have to collect the data. We have to get much better data because algorithms are not humans and we think of them as better than humans, but they're only as good as the data that we feed them. And if we feed them bad data, they're far worse than humans. So that's the first thing we need to do. First of all, we need to recognize that algorithms are not a panacea. They're not going to solve our problems for us. Second, we have to get really serious about getting the data that we need, getting proper sex disaggregated data. I think also another really important thing that we need to get serious about is transparency in AI. A huge part of the problem is simply that we can't check these algorithms. We don't know what they're doing. And there's absolutely no need for it. There is no need to not be able to see what data it is that you're using and how you're using that data and how you're accounting for that data, because that is the only way that we're going to ensure that AI doesn't lead us down a pretty dark path.
Just following up on that, because we're running out of time. So a question from Women in IT. We have another group at the fund, Women in IT. The question is, do you think big data can help us solve some of these problems?
Yeah, it can, but only if the big data is sex disaggregated and gender balanced. And that's the problem, is that it often isn't. We have this sort of idea of big data as the answer to our problems, but often the big data is no good. It's not good data. So yes, big data can absolutely be very helpful, and there are people actually trying to develop algorithms to help deal with this bias in data, and that's a really fantastic route. That's really great to see. So yes, technology can absolutely help with this, but it's only ever going to be as good as the data that we have.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm afraid we're out of time. So I'd like to thank Caroline. Thank you very, very much for joining us. For those who haven't read it, please do read Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. You will never again see the world the same way, I can assure you. And on that note, thank you very much to all of you who've tuned in to join us today.